When we tap on a cell in the search results to select it, it loads a second table view that displays all the artist's albums. So back in the storyboard scene, let's drag out another table view controller. Once you place it, let's control drag from the prototype cell here over to the new table view controller to create a new segue. We want a show segue so that the second table view is pushed onto the navigation stack to indicate hierarchy of information. Let's set the identifier property on this new segue to show albums with an S. And then if we run the app to make sure this works, so search iTunes, we'll tap here to get our fake data, and then we'll tap to go to this new view controller. So this works, but you'll notice that the search bar is still present on the top. So to fix this, let's head over to the search results controller subclass. And in ViewDidLoad, we're going to add another piece of code. ViewDidLoad is getting a bit crowded, so we might have to clean this up. But we're going to say defines presentation context equal true. This property takes a Boolean value that indicates whether this view controller's view is covered when the view controller, or one of its descendants, presents another view controller. So by setting it to true, it is indeed covered, which includes covering the search bar. So if we run it now, search iTunes, tap on the search bar, get the result, and there we go. That looks better. When you ran the app, you might have run into some weird behavior where tapping on the results cell segued to the new table view controller but was presented modally instead of being pushed onto the nav stack as indicated. Now, I ran into that when I was prototyping the app, and the way I worked around it was to embed each table view controller into its own navigation controller. The segue would still go from one table view controller to another, but then we got the desired behavior. Okay, so now we have our scene set up. So let's focus on creating this prototype cell right here for the new table view controller. We're going to set the prototype to custom, and we'll give it a custom height of 80 points in the size inspector. Next, let's drag out an image view, drop it right in there, and give it the following constraints. So we're going to give it a height and width of 80 points. You're going to set it leading space to superview, 0 points, and top space to superview, 0 points. Essentially, we want it to fill the entire cell top to bottom. In the teacher's notes, there's a link to download an image called AlbumPlaceholder. Add this to your asset catalog, and then set the image view's image to this placeholder with a content mode of aspect fit. So head over to the attributes inspector, and then image, album placeholder, and content mode, aspect fit. Okay, next, let's drag out 3 labels. So 1, 2, and 3. For the first one, let's set the text to album title and leave the rest of the settings as default. For the second one, give it a text of genre. We're going to set the color to light gray. And for the font, we'll set it to 14 points for the system font. For the last label, we're going to use this to display the album's release date. So we'll set the text to Jan 01, 2017. So this is the date format that we'll eventually be using to show the release dates to users. For this one as well, we'll set the color to light gray and the font to 14 points. Now, select all 3 labels. You can hold down the Shift button to do this. And then we're going to click the second button from the left in the Auto Layout submenu to embed them in a stack view. Since all we're going to do is lay these labels out vertically with equal spacing, it's easier to let the stack view do the work. So if you have the stack view selected, which might be easier in the document's outline, in the Attributes Inspector, make sure the axis is set to vertical, the alignment is set to leading, and the distribution is set to equal spacing. And give it a spacing value of 4 points. All this means is that the labels will now be 4 points away from each other. Now, instead of adding constraints to the labels individually, we can just add constraints to position the stack view, and it'll handle all of the subviews. So we're going to center this vertically in the container, and give it a leading space to the image view with 8 points of spacing. Designing the prototype cell isn't enough though. We still need a TableViewController subclass and a custom cell subclass. Before we leave the storyboard file, let's give this prototype right here, this TableViewCell, a reuse identifier of album cell. Okay, now in the controllers group, let's add a new file. This is a CocoaTouch class, a subclass of UI TableViewController, and we'll call this AlbumListController. Like the last one, we're just going to go ahead and get rid of all the boilerplate code because we will be working through this ourselves. For now, we're going to implement a single delegate method to adjust the row height, because remember, just setting a custom height in a prototype cell doesn't mean it'll be reflected like that in the table view. Now, instead of just returning 80, which is the height we want, that's going to look like a magic number that doesn't have much meaning. So we're going to create a private struct in here with a static property to hold on to this constant value. This way, again, we get some namespacing and meaning around the value. So private struct constants, static let album cell height. This is of type CG float, and the value is 80. Now notice that I'm using upper camel case here for the name, and that's because it's a somewhat loosely applied convention for constant values. So down here, I can say, let me move that up so you can see that a bit better. I can say table view delegate, and we're going to implement height for row at index path, and I'll return constants.albumCellHeight. Next, we need a custom cell subclass. So right-click on the Views group, add a new file, CocoaTouch subclass again. This is going to be a subclass of UI Table View Cell, and we'll call this, you guessed it, Album Cell. Now in here, to start off, let's add a static property to keep reference to that reuse identifier we defined. So static let reuse identifier equal album cell. Now all that's left to do now is go back to the storyboard. We can assign these new subclasses as underlying classes for the scenes. So TableViewController, Identity Inspector, this is now the AlbumListController, and the cell has an underlying class of AlbumCell. Perfect. Okay, now we need to set the outlets from this prototype cell to go over to our custom subclass. So clear up some room, go to the assistant editor, and we want to find which is under the views group, the album cell. Okay, and add our outlets. So first is, this is the correct, there we go, let's see. Okay, so the first one is the image view, and we'll call this artwork view. Next is the album title, and we'll call this album title label. After that is the genre label. And then finally, the release date label. Okay, perfect. With this UI setup, we can now go ahead and implement a data source object so we can display our stub data inside this TableViewController.